Statement, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary James Brokenshire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and with permission I would like to make a statement about the political situation in Northern Ireland. As the House will recall, following the resignation of Martin McGuinness, the then Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, in January, an election took place to the Northern Ireland Assembly on the 2nd of March. Despite intensive discussions in the 3 weeks following the election, the Northern Ireland parties were unable to reach agreement on the formation of a new executive. In order to facilitate further discussions between the parties, Parliament passed legislation immediately prior to dissolution, extending the period in which an executive could be formed until the 29th of June. Last Thursday, the 29th of June, I made a statement in Belfast setting out that while differences remain between the parties, progress had been made and that it was still possible for resolution to be achieved. I urge the parties to continue focusing their efforts on this with the full support of the UK Government and, as appropriate, the Irish Government. And in that regard, I want to recognise the contribution of the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, and his predecessor, Charlie Flanagan. In the past few days, since the passing of the deadline, some progress has continued to be made, including on the most challenging issues, such as language, culture, and identity. But gaps remain between the parties on a defined number of issues. The Government remains committed to working with the parties and the Irish Government to find a way to close these gaps quickly in order to reach an agreement which will pave the way for the restoration of devolved government. The Prime Minister has been actively involved following on from her meetings with each of the parties, including speaking to Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill on Friday night. I continue to believe that a deal remains achievable, and if agreement is reached, I will bring forward legislation to enable an executive to be formed, possibly as early as this week. But time is short. It has been 6 months since a full executive was in place to represent the people of Northern Ireland. In that time, it has been civil servants, not politicians, who have made decisions on spending. Without political direction, it has not been possible for strategic decisions to be made about priorities in areas such as education and health. This has created pressures which need to be addressed, and it has led to understandable concern and uncertainty amongst businesses and those relying on public services alike, as well as the community and voluntary sector. This hiatus cannot simply continue for much longer. There is no doubt that the best outcome is for a new executive to make those strategic decisions in the interests of all parts of the community in Northern Ireland. It should be for a new executive to make swift decisions on its budget, to make use of the considerable spending power available to it. While engagement between the parties continues, and there is prospect of an agreement, it is right that those discussions remain our focus. At the same time, we will not forget our ultimate responsibility as a government to uphold political stability and good governance in Northern Ireland. In April, I made a written ministerial statement that sought to provide clarity for those civil servants charged with allocating cash in Northern Ireland to assist them in the discharge of their responsibilities. There remains £42 million in resources flowing from the spring budget and budget transfers from the last financial year, which have remained unallocated in order to provide an incoming executive with the room to decide on how it should best be spent. But if we don't see resolution in the coming days, then it will become urgent that we reflect further upon whether clarity is required for Northern Ireland permanent secretaries about the allocation of those resources. In that situation, we would also need to reflect carefully on how we might allocate funding made available to address immediate health and education pressures, as set out in last Monday's statement on UK government financial support for Northern Ireland, recognising Northern Ireland's particular circumstances. And if no agreement is reached, legislation in Westminster may then be required to give authority for the expenditure of Northern Ireland departments through an appropriations bill. Now, from my conversations with the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, we have not quite reached that critical point yet. But that point is coming, and the lack of a formal budget is not something that can be sustained indefinitely. Similarly, decisions on capital expenditure and infrastructure and public service reform in key sectors such as the health service cannot be deferred for much longer. One area on which there is much consensus, however, is on the need for greater transparency around political donations. And in line with the commitment set out in the Conservative Party's Northern Ireland manifesto at the general election, I can confirm that I intend to bring forward legislation that will provide for the publication of all donations and loans received by Northern Ireland parties on or after the 1st of July 2017. Mr. Speaker, all of this reinforces further the importance of the parties coming together and reaching an agreement. And it sets out, too, some of the hard choices we face if uncertainty persists. I'm also conscious that with the deadline now passed, I am under a duty to set a new date for a new election, and I will continue to keep that duty under review. But it seems unlikely that that would of itself resolve the current political impasse or the ultimate need for political decision-making, however we proceed. As the government for the whole United Kingdom, we will always govern in the interests of all those within the United Kingdom. And so if resolution were to prove intractable and an executive could not be restored, then we would, of course, be ready to do what is needed to provide that political decision-making in the best interests of Northern Ireland. But I am clear that the return of inclusive, devolved government by a power-sharing executive is what would be profoundly in the best interests of Northern Ireland. And that will remain our overriding focus in the crucial days ahead. The UK government will continue to govern in the interests of everyone in Northern Ireland by providing political stability and keeping an open and sustained dialogue with the parties and with the Irish government in accordance with the well-established three-stranded approach. I stand ready to do what is necessary to facilitate the quick formation of an executive once an agreement is reached, and that is where our focus should lie. I commend this statement to the House.
Owen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by also thanking the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement today and for his very welcome efforts to keep me regularly updated on progress in the talks. I know that the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, have been working incredibly hard, as have all of the parties, to try and narrow the gap between them on the outstanding issues, in particular in respect of languages, culture and identity, as he said. And I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State hasn't come here today to say the shutters are coming down on the talks and that he still is optimistic. In fact, I admire his sustained, slightly surprising optimism that a deal might be done this week. Because people in Belfast and across Northern Ireland will have heard his contention that there does remain the prospect of a deal. And if that is achieved, he should know that he will enjoy our full support on this side of the House to put in place whatever legislation is necessary in order to get the executive reformed and the Assembly to meet. But I think there will be some legitimate frustration amongst many Northern Ireland citizens that fully 6 months after the executive broke down, and a little more than a week before the marching season reaches its apogee on the 12th, that we still remain at this impasse. And there will also be some scepticism as to the likelihood of his surmounting it in a few short days. So hard questions, Mr. Speaker, must now be asked about what more his government can do to assist the parties in moving forward. Now, it's encouraging that the Prime Minister picked up the phone to the leaders of the DUP and Sinn Féin on Friday night, but I would invite the Secretary of State, in this new spirit of free speech that seems to be abroad in the Conservative Party, to agree with me that the Prime Minister could do a bit more that he could tell her to get a bit more involved herself, indeed to get on a plane to Belfast herself. I'm sure that Arlene Foster wouldn't mind lending her hers for the weekend. Because history has told us, on this side of the House and on his, that the involvement, the direct involvement of the Prime Minister in the Taoiseach can sometimes help bridge the divide in Northern Ireland. It can move things forward. And it is a surprise to me that this Prime Minister continues to seem reluctant to take personal responsibility to break the deadlock. In fact, I think I and many in Northern Ireland would feel that the current Prime Minister has a particular duty to take some personal responsibility to get more involved, as it was her decision last April to call a general election that lengthened the hiatus, the impasse, and took us so close to July the 12th. And it's also her reliance now on the DUP, a legitimate reliance given the arithmetic of this House, but it's her reliance on the DUP that is being cited by other interlocutors in the talks as part of the reason for the impasse. So I agree with the Secretary of State that the hiatus can't simply continue for much longer, but I would like to hear a bit more from him about what he's going to do to resolve it, because if it isn't with greater hands-on involvement by the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach, as I and others have suggested, does he think there's a role for a new, independent, impartial, international, perhaps, chairman of the talks, with fresh eyes and a new mandate? In the past, that too has played an important means of shifting things. And I noted, Mr. Speaker, the coded warning that the Secretary of State gave, I think quite rightly, that if a way forward isn't found, then he will have to bring forward further budgetary transfers to give extra clarity and certainty to the Northern Ireland civil service. That may well be necessary, and again, if so, he will enjoy our support. But I'm not sure it's going to provide much of a spur that to the parties involved, because they're used to this limbo land now for the next 6 months. And he does agree with me, I know, that it's profoundly unsatisfactory for strategic decisions to be put off and for Northern Ireland to be in the hands of unelected civil servants, no matter how well-intentioned and competent they are. An appropriations bill may prove to be a bigger spur, but some will see that effectively, he will know, as a return to direct rule. And I'm sure that's a position that he will wish to avoid, and I would urge him to take all possible steps to avoid it. Mr. Speaker, may I welcome the decision the Secretary of State has taken today to legislate for publication of all political loans and donations received by parties in Northern Ireland after July the 1st. That's an important step in normalising the politics of Northern Ireland. That might strike some as a bit ironic in light of the recent deal with the DUP. May I ask him just a few questions about it? Does he intend that the thresholds that will apply to that legislation are the same that apply presently to donations and loans across the rest of the UK? And will the same requirement apply that all donors are registered voters in the UK also apply? Finally, Mr. Speaker, may I say to the Secretary of State that I'm sure you agree with me that Northern Ireland needs its Assembly and Executive up and running as soon as possible. There is no greater illustration than the fact that we are now entering the negotiations in earnest on Brexit, and Northern Ireland effectively has no voice at that negotiating table, certainly not one that reflects all of the traditions and cultures and heritages of Northern Ireland. There is an absolute imperative that we get the executive back on its feet and that Northern Ireland has its voice restored. And I'm sure he will join with me in urging all members to urge all parties to make sure that happens as soon as possible.
Well, I would certainly join with the Right Honourable Gentleman in underlining that core message that he ended with. And I appreciate and welcome the support that he has given to the government if we are able to reach that point where agreement is concluded and to be able to move swiftly in this House. And I appreciate the opportunity that we have had to discuss these issues over the last few days, and will certainly be maintaining that dialogue with him. He raises a number of points. In particular, he highlighted the issue of frustration of the people of Northern Ireland. And I think there are so many people that will be frustrated in not seeing a deal having been concluded thus far, and therefore how we can see that conclusion and seeing a power-sharing executive, an inclusive power-sharing executive, getting on and making those decisions in the best interests of Northern Ireland by locally elected politicians. And I know that that is a theme that does bind us together. He asked about the engagement of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister has been involved in this throughout this process. She met all of the leaders of the political parties here in London, has maintained contact throughout that time, and as I've indicated, has also spoken to the leaders of the two main parties in recent days, as she had done previously. And so he will also, I think, reflect and recognise that particular interventions may not necessarily have the desired outcome. I know from his previous time when he was involved in matters relating to Northern Ireland, long time at places like Leeds Castle as well, that did not lead to that outcome that I'm sure he himself would have wished for at that time. And so there are different solutions, different scenarios that present themselves in different cases. And I would say that there is a defined number of issues that do remain outstanding, and I think it is that focus and attention that we need to give at this time, rather than extending out and changing the whole dynamic. But obviously we will continue to keep matters under careful review. The whole point is that I think that resolution should be capable if the willingness is there. And therefore it is, I think, with that urgency that we must approach the days ahead. Obviously there is opportunity here. I spoke about the additional funding that could be available to an executive, to use an incoming executive to act and take some of those strategic decisions. And I think it is so profoundly in Northern Ireland's interest to see that that is the case from locally elected politicians. I will set out perhaps to the Right Honourable Gentleman in further detail in relation to the transparency issues on political donations. I think that is probably the best way, and I will put a letter in the House Library as well, setting out further detail. Obviously, I will be introducing legislation that will spell all of that out too, so that everyone can see very, very clearly the next steps around all of that.
Order. Consistent with what I said to the House last week, I'm keen to uphold the tradition that members wishing to take part in exchanges on a statement should be those and only those who were here at its start. I don't wish to embarrass individuals. I know a couple of members who came in late, who very graciously are not standing, but that is not uniform, and those who are standing shouldn't be doing so. It's quite wrong to wander in halfway through the statement and then expect to be called. Some people might even think it's a tad arrogant, but there you go. Mr. Laurence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Secretary of State that, regardless of the difficulties or the disagreements in Northern Ireland among the parties, isn't it the case that those issues should be sorted out within the Assembly and within the Executive and not in this place? Or is it the case that maybe one party or maybe more are actually looking for a rewriting of the rules?
Well, I'm grateful for to my right honourable friend for his continued focus on issues relating to Northern Ireland, and obviously in the last Parliament and his chairmanship of the Select Committee. I think all parties are focused on seeking to get an outcome here and seeing that we have a functioning executive rather than fundamental changes to the rules. And I think that that is where our attention should be given, because, as I think he indicates from his question, that is where I think he realises that decision-making should be taken within Northern Ireland, within the Assembly, within the Executive, acting in the best interests of Northern Ireland.
Deidre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's disappointing, to say the least, that there hasn't been a deal made and the proper governance of Northern Ireland cannot restart. Will the Secretary of State accept that his party's deal with the DUP makes reaching a deal more difficult? And does he consider the link between his ministerial colleague, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary in the Department for Exiting the European Union, and the Constitutional Research Council, which made the questionable Brexit donation to the DUP, to be an additional and unwelcome complication? And why did it take 3 years from the consultation on increasing transparency in Northern Ireland's political donations to get to the position where the government is now announcing that it will be bringing legislation forward? The murk that surrounds this whole affair at times makes it increasingly difficult to trust that there is true impartiality in the government. What can he do to clear up the questions around the Constitutional Research Council and its donations and restore confidence in the government's impartiality? And Lastly, Mr Speaker, the devolved administrations are supposed to be involved in the Brexit negotiations. Can the Secretary of State tell us who has been providing the input from Stormont and whether this is less or more than the input from the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government? And very lastly, what representations were made to him by the Secretary of State for Scotland about the deal done between the Government and the DUP?
Well, I should just say, in defence of the Honourable Lady, there was a certain amount of harumphing from a sedentary position at the continuation of the Honourable Lady's line of interrogation, but I can confirm that she was fully 36 seconds within her time. Secretary of State. That is a matter of stylistic, or even on the part of the Right Honourable Gentleman, aesthetic objection, but it cannot be said to be a matter of order. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It may not surprise the Honourable Lady to say, no, I don't agree with the analysis that she has just set out in her questions. We stand full square by our undertakings under the Belfast Agreement and its successors, and the agreement relating to decision-making here at Westminster does not contravene those very important elements, something which is actually spelled out specifically in that agreement itself. She highlights the issue about political donations and transparency, and I would say to her that we conducted a consultation with all of the political parties in Northern Ireland to seek their views first, and therefore that was the reason why we took the decision that we have done today, reflecting on those views, reflecting on that input and how that was a commitment in my own party's manifesto. She also highlights the issue of Brexit and contact with the Northern Ireland Executive. Well, obviously, there aren't elected politicians there, and so we've obviously sought to engage with the Northern Ireland Civil Service within the Northern Ireland Executive, but obviously that takes us only so far, and why I profoundly believe that we want to see an executive into place to be that additional voice for Northern Ireland, very strongly making the points and ensuring that alongside them we do get the best possible deal for Northern Ireland through EU exit.
Something extraordinary state of affairs. So I was planning to call the Right Honourable Gentleman, but he now seems a little disengaged from our proceedings. The Right Honourable Gentleman toddled up to the chair, and I thought he was interested, and he can speak. Go on, Mr Paterson, let's hear.
I did come to apologise for missing the first 2 minutes, but as you've called me, Mr Speaker, very grateful. Can I ask for my Right Honourable friend, can he confirm that unless we have a fully up and running executive, we cannot implement corporation tax, which will benefit every single citizen?
I thought the Right Honourable Gentleman had just come up to the chair and muttered some prosaic pleasantry, which I readily greeted. I hadn't realised he was late. It's very honest of him to say that he was, but I hadn't known that he was, and therefore, as far as I'm concerned, he wasn't. Secretary of State.
Regrettably, in answer to my Right Honourable friend's question, the answer is without an executive being in place, the devolution of corporation tax cannot happen, and I think it underlines one of many reasons why an executive is needed to get on to see that vision of prosperity, further investment taking place, and how an executive would absolutely aid that.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We welcome the statement, and for the record, the Democratic Unionist Party was ready last Thursday to form a government and to appoint our ministers, so there is no question of any reticence on our part about forming an executive, and we have been encouraged by the government to do so. Can I ask the Secretary of State, in relation to legacy, will the government proceed to publish the proposals on legacy in the event that an executive isn't formed? And we welcome what the Secretary of State has said on donations. We support that. Will this extend to include donations that are routed via the Republic of Ireland to political parties operating in Northern Ireland?
Well, as the Honourable Gentleman may know, the consultation that we ran in relation to political transparency was on the narrow elements that were contained within that. But I know that there are other issues and other points that have been made, including the matter that he has referenced in his own question, and they will remain under consideration. I also want to come back on his point in respect of the issue of legacy. And I think that there is growing consensus that we do need to get that consultation out there and show everyone the work that has gone in around the implementation of the Stormont House bodies, actually starting to see that coming into effect. And therefore, I earnestly hope that we will be able to move forward with that, and that will take place following the establishment of an executive.
Sir Hugo Swire.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But isn't the simple truth that whereas the Democratic Unionist Party have managed to obtain £1 billion from the Treasury to spend on the people of Northern Ireland, Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams and those at Connolly House, by refusing to reform the executive, are going to be in no position, because there's going to be no Sinn Féin minister in the executive, to make sure that their constituents get an equal share of that money, because that money will either be spent by ministers in this place or in civil servants in Northern Ireland.
Well, I think the simple point is that by having an executive there, a First Minister, a Deputy First Minister and other ministers, they are then able to make decisions on budgets, on all issues across the whole of the community. And the funding that has been outlined on issues such as health, education, mental health, infrastructure, broadband, they are profoundly for everyone across Northern Ireland, all communities, how they would benefit from that. And that, I think, again, underlines the need to have that executive and to see that locally elected politicians are the ones making those decisions.
Vernon Coaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're all pleased that the Secretary of State has said to us that a deal is still possible within the next few days. He will know as well as I do that trust is imperative in these talks. And can he explain a little further why he's so reluctant in order to try and seal this deal between the two sides within Northern Ireland? Why is he so reluctant to get the Prime Minister and the Taoiseach to go to Belfast to try and bring the parties together with these final solutions, these final things that need to be done in order for a deal to be done?
Well, I hear the point that the Right Honourable Gentleman makes in relation to this, and I would stress that the Prime Minister has been actively involved throughout this whole process, in actually having those meetings with all of the party leaders, in talking. She had a further conversation with the Taoiseach last week about how matters were progressing, and indeed to receive updates from myself and also Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Minister, to the Taoiseach too. There is that continued active engagement, and to the extent that further interventions are required, of course, we will always keep that under review to see what will effectively bring about resolution and see the executive that I know that he and I would want to see in place.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I of course, understand the points my right honourable friend was making about the fact that this situation can't go on forever. But one of the virtues that are required, and one of the many virtues in his arduous post, is that of patience. And I hope he will be able to assure the House that he will be exhibiting that even beyond the level of the proverbial saint in order to get a power-sharing agreement in place in a new executive.
Well, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for his support and his indication that some patience is needed. But I would equally underline to him that there has been a lot of patience exhibited up to now, and that there is a lot of frustration of the public in Northern Ireland who want to see services for them acting in the way that needs to be undertaken, to see the sort of transformation that needs to happen in certain key services, and why an executive is so desperately needed at the earliest opportunity to see politics performing for the best interests of Northern Ireland and to see that change happen.
Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I do not often hanker after the days of Tony Blair. But I have to say that if we had reached this state of affairs under his premiership, we would have seen not just involvement by the Prime Minister, but active leadership, and probably making the statement to the House here. It's a matter of regret, with all due respect to the Secretary of State, that the Prime Minister is not here today. The Secretary of State is quite right when he says that we need greater transparency around political donations, but he must be aware that the House has already expressed its view on this. The Miscellaneous Provisions Act set the date for being, the relevant date as being the 1st of January 2014. Why is he now seeking to change that?
I think the simple point on that is that it's about compliance with the regulations, to see that those making donations are able to make those determinations based on the law that is in existence, rather than looking at retrospection. But obviously there will be further opportunity for the House to debate this issue, but I think that that is the clearest way of doing it.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Whilst the political situation remains in limbo in Northern Ireland, elderly and frail British former soldiers are even now being brought before the courts on serious charges, whilst multiple terrorist murderers walk free, having served either derisory sentences or no sentences at all. Can the Secretary of State assure us that the government remains focused on rectifying this inequality of treatment?
Well, I know that this is an issue that my honourable friend has raised consistently in this House, and others too, and I commend them for the focus that they have given. What I would say is that as a government we do remain committed to implementing the Stormont House institutions, and actually that reform that is about fair, balanced and proportionate efforts in respect of the investigations of the past. That is what that agreement sets out very clearly in applying the rule of law. But as I've said on a number of occasions in this House, I will never tire from the recognition that I have and others across government have of the tireless contribution that so many in our security and armed forces provided to ensure that we have the peace today, and that without their contribution that simply would not have been possible.
Mr. David Hanson.
It's not easy, Mr. Speaker, to establish devolved government, and when we did that in 2007 and 6, we did it because the Prime Minister of the day spent 80 hours in St Andrews, hands-on, dealing with all parties with the Taoiseach of Ireland. So that's just advice to the Minister, that it's not a disservice to him and his colleagues to have the Prime Minister engaged heavily. The point I want to ask him, however, is, given the £1 billion that has been expended by the government, could he assure the House that no expenditure decisions will be taken in the absence of a devolved government by civil servants on expenditure priorities for that money?
Well, what I would say to the Right Honourable Gentleman is that there are clear needs in Northern Ireland, which is why I made the point that I did around the potential need for further clarification to the Northern Ireland Civil Service in respect of budgetary issues. And also I would underline to him that last week's statement did recognise the particular needs, the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland, and how there are some urgent and pressing priorities. It's why I think an executive does need to be put into place. But clearly, in acting in the best interest of Northern Ireland, we will keep that very closely under review if an executive is not possible to be formed in the coming days.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you. I'd like to ask my right honourable friend about the situation on the border, especially regarding the Brexit negotiations. As a member of this House who was born in Northern Ireland, I know how important it is not to go back to the hard border that I remember from my childhood. But given that both the British negotiators and the EU negotiators have said that they do not wish to see a hard border, how soon do you think we could make sure that this situation is resolved in order to make sure that the people of Northern Ireland know that their future is more certain?
Well, as my honourable friend will know from her experience, that the issue of Northern Ireland is a priority item in the Brexit negotiations, that discussions have commenced. Indeed, the work that we continue to do in that regard on providing that assurance around border and other issues, and how as a government we believe that a solution can be found, that there is goodwill on all sides in relation to finding that solution, reaching that agreement through the common travel area, and also looking at the issue of the movement of goods and goods as well across the border to ensure that it remains invisible and seamless, and that is a clear and firm priority of this government to achieve.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, my party is also disappointed that the executive has not been re-established after being brought down by Sinn Féin early in this year. But will the Secretary of State confirm that only one party in Northern Ireland is insisting on any preconditions on the setting up of the executive, and that those preconditions are so unreasonable, including the prosecution of soldiers and policemen, the establishment of an Irish Language Act, which would cost tens of millions of pounds, the commitment by this party to overthrow its manifesto commitments, and the refusal to sit with Arlene Foster, who won at the last election. Will he confirm that those conditions amount to blackmail, and that the establishment of any executive on that basis would be fragile and could not possibly exist? And maybe he could also confirm to us today, has he given in to Sinn Féin's demand that there be no transparency on the funds which they receive through the Irish Republic from foreign countries to their own party coffers?
Well, I know that there are strong views on a number of issues, and what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that I know that his party and Sinn Féin continue in the discussions to find resolution on these issues, that work and discussions are even continuing today, shortly before this session started, to resolve differences. And I think it is that element where focus needs to lie, to see that we have an executive performing in the best interest of Northern Ireland, something that I know that his party have strongly indicated that they want to see. And therefore, I think it is that focus that we will continue to support all the parties involved in this process, to find that resolution, to look beyond difference of parties, recognising also that the political process in Northern Ireland is very special, something that so many people have worked so hard to get us to this point. And I think he and others would all want to see that progressing into the future, and seeing that we do see that positive, bright future for Northern Ireland across all communities.
James Heappey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The additional funds committed to Northern Ireland in recent weeks continue to be wrongly labelled as money for a single party in the province. Will the Secretary of State reconfirm that this is in fact money for the whole province to be spent by all parties, and it represents $1 billion more reasons for political leadership to be restored at Stormont?
I think my honourable friend makes a very clear and important point, that the funding package that was announced last week was very firmly for the benefit of all communities, to actually see that investment in infrastructure that has not kept pace with other parts of the UK, to deal with issues where we have employment rates that are behind other nations of the United Kingdom, and also to deal with reform in certain key public services too. That is for the benefit of all communities in Northern Ireland, and why we do want to see that executive actually able to make decisions and seeing them feeling the real benefit of that, and why I think that that does provide that real potential, that real opportunity, which we want to see seized.
Conor McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This crisis has meandered across 6 months, 2 elections, and as of today, 2.5 missed deadlines. But I'm afraid I still don't get any sense of urgency from the Secretary of State. There is a time for passive observation, and there is a time for intensive intervention. Why won't the Prime Minister go to Belfast with the Taoiseach and find a resolution to this that we all want to see?
I agree with the honourable gentleman that we do want to see that resolution, and that there have been interventions that have been made by the UK government, the Irish government, and also seeking that those sort of supportive voices to assist in community and elsewhere, to get the parties focused on seeing that bigger picture, looking beyond difference, and being able to get an executive formed. We will use all interventions appropriately to get that outcome. And that's why I make the point about the work the Prime Minister has done, the work that I have done, the work the Irish Government have done, the work that the Taoiseach and the Irish Foreign Minister have done, but also the fact that time is progressing, the key point that he made, and why we do not want to see those sort of interventions that I've highlighted in this statement, because time is moving on, and if we don't see resolution quickly, then there will be a need to do various steps around budget and other issues too, and why we are still working hard to support the parties. But ultimately, it is for the parties to reach that agreement, to see that those divides crossed, such that an executive is formed. And I can assure him of the urgency, the attention, the time and effort that continues to be made in that regard.
Nigel Mills.
As the only member on this side of the chamber to vote for transparency of donations 3 years ago, can I welcome his decision to bring that forward. In relation to resolving the impasse, can you confirm that the £1 billion announced last week will be sufficient and there'll be no more need for money from Westminster to get this deal over the line?
Well, I think that the funds that were announced last week clearly, I think, should provide that sense of opportunity, that sense of potential on those issues that are clearly of relevance to Northern Ireland, on the lack of transport infrastructure compared to other parts of the United Kingdom, on the issue of digital and broadband, which has lagged behind other parts of the United Kingdom. And I think that it should give that sense of incentive, that sense of opportunity of how an executive can deliver and get on with so many of the things that it wants to see.
Dennis Skinner.
Is the Minister aware that this impasse in Northern Ireland has been complicated by the fact that the result of the general election has meant that the government has had to get involved in a protection money racketing system of about £1 billion. The only way to get rid of that, may I say, as a suggestion, is for the Prime Minister to call another general election. We know that she's frightened to death of doing it because she knows that the Labour Party would win and we would form a government. We'd get rid of this almighty mess. There'd be no protection racket money and we'd have a decent Labour government that'd get rid of austerity. Get on with it.
You're lost.
Well, it sounds as if the honourable gentleman still has not recognised the results of the last election, and whilst the House will be interested in his comments, I don't think they will make any difference in actually solving the real problems that we're wrestling with in Northern Ireland.
Jonathan Edwards.
Mr. Speaker, if the impasse is not broken and direct rule is imposed, can the Joint Ministerial Committee on European Negotiations perform its role without the participation of one of the constituent parts of the British state?
Well, as I've indicated in my statement already, we are very firmly not looking at interventions that are even getting to the point that he is alluding to, and that would profoundly not be in Northern Ireland's best interest to be heading down that way, which is why I make the point about the executive. The best way to address his point is by seeing an executive into place, seeing a First and Deputy First Minister able to represent Northern Ireland and argue very firmly in Northern Ireland's best interests on Brexit and on so many other issues.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This is an unusual Parliament in that there's no representation because of the loss of seats by the SDLP and the very unwelcome continuing refusal of Sinn Féin to take their seats in this chamber. There's no representation of Irish nationalist opinion from the island of Ireland for the first time in many, many decades. Given what the Secretary of State said in the statement about the possibility of having to bring forward legislation in the near future regarding Northern Ireland, how will he ensure that that strain of opinion from Northern Ireland is fully taken into account in consideration of that legislation?
Well, I'm certainly very conscious in my role as Secretary of State in listening to voices from all parts of the community. And obviously in this House there are no voices from the nationalist community that are now represented in this House, and therefore I will continue to engage intensively with all parties in Northern Ireland, to continue to listen, to continue to hear specific points that they make, and ensure that that is reflected into my own consideration and the consideration of government more broadly as we look at the legislative programme ahead.
Liam Paisley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. You're very kind. The Speaker and indeed the Secretary of State will know my utter commitment to devolution. But at some point, there's got to be a realisation that the parrot could possibly be dead, that it has deceased of life, it is no more. And if that is the case about devolution, can he put a time frame, can the Secretary of State put a time frame on the life expectancy that is ultimately left in this dead bird? Will appropriations be moved before the summer recess?
Well, the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service has indicated that we are not at that point yet in terms of the need for an appropriations bill to be passed. I think that we are still a little way away from that. But nonetheless, I think that there are urgent issues that do need to be addressed in terms of the financial position in Northern Ireland, why I made the points I did in my statement around the potential need for further assurance to be granted. And I would say that I think there is still very firmly life there. I think that the engagement that we continue to see underlines that, and profoundly, that is what is in Northern Ireland's best interest, to have locally elected politicians serving the community in Northern Ireland, something I know that he believes in very strongly. And as a government, we will certainly not be giving up on that. We are working tirelessly to ensure that we see this reconciliation, that we see this outcome that he and I know is what Northern Ireland needs. And I earnestly hope that with the effort that continues to be given, that we will see that progress and see the implementation of a power-sharing executive in a very short period of time.
Thank you.